Hello, Shiremia Seri, audiobook narrator here. It seems like even when I plan on plan on my being late, I'm late for the time that I'm late. Apologies. Basically, we had a massive windstorm in Seattle. Just branches landing on roofs all night long. So, yeah, I slept in. So, apologies, but let's roll right into Lud-in-the-Mist, chapter 27. Chapter 27. The Fair in the Elfin Marches. About 2 hours after he had set out from the farm, Master Nathaniel reached a snug little hollow at the foot of the hills, chosen for their camp by the consignment of the Lud yeomanry stationed, by his own orders, at the foot of the Debatable Hills. "Halt!" cried the sentry, and then he dropped his musket in amazement. "Well, I'm blessed if it ain't his worship," he cried. Some 6 or 7 of his mates who were lounging about the camp, some playing cards, some lying on their backs and staring up at the sky, came hurrying up at the sound of the challenge and, speechless with astonishment, they stared at Master Nathaniel. "I have come to look for my son," he said. "I have been told that, he came this way some 2 or 3 nights ago. If so, you must have seen him." The yeomen shook their heads. "No, your worship, we've seen no little boy. In fact, all the weeks we've been here, we've not seen a living soul. And if there are any folks about, they must be as swift as swallows and as silent-footed as cats and as hard to see. Well, and if there are any folks about, they must be as swift as swallows and as silent-footed as cats and as hard to see, well, as the dead themselves. No, your worship, little Master Chanticleer has not passed this way." Master Nathaniel sighed wearily. "I had a feeling that you would not have seen him," he said, adding dreamily more to himself than to them. "Who knows? He may have gone by the Milky Way." And then it struck him that this was probably the last normal encounter he would ever have with ordinary human beings, and he smiled at them wistfully. "Well, well," he said, "you're having a pleasant holiday, I expect. Nothing to do and plenty to eat and drink, eh? Here's a couple crowns." "Here's a couple of crowns for you. Send to one of the farms for a pigskin of red wine and drink my health, and my son's. I'm off on what may prove a very long journey. I suppose this bridle path will be as good a route as any?" They stared at him in amazement. "Please, your worship, if you'll excuse me mentioning it, you must be making a mistake," said the sentry in a shocked voice. "All the bridle paths about here lead to nowhere but the elfin marches, and beyond." "It is for beyond that I am bound," answered Master Nathaniel curtly, and digging his spurs into his horse's flanks, he dashed past the horrified yeoman and up one of the bridle paths, as if he would take the Debatable Hills by storm. For a few seconds they stood staring at one another with scared, astonished eyes. Then the sentry gave a low whistle. "He must be powerful fond of that little chap," he said. "If the little chap really slipped past—" There goes my teleprompter app. If the little chap really slipped past without our seeing him, that would be the third Chanticleer to cross the hills. First there was the little missy at the academy, then the young chap, then the mayor. Aye, but they didn't do it on an empty stomach, leastways we know the crabapple blossoms didn't. Aye, but they didn't do it on an empty stomach. Leastways, we know the crabapple blossoms didn't. And if the talk in Lud be true, the little chap had had a taste too of what he oughtn't, said another. Should be another's voice. Aye, but they didn't do it on him. Aye, but they didn't do it on an empty stomach. Leastways, we know the crabapple blossoms didn't. And if the talk in Lud be true, the little chap had had a taste of too. And if the talk in Lud be true, the little chap had had a taste too of what he oughtn't, said another. But it's another story to go when you're in your. Blah, blah, blah. But it's another story to go when you're in your right mind. But it's another story to go when you're in your right mind. But it's another story to go when you're in your right mind. Dr. Lear can't have been in the right when he said all them magistrates were played out, for it's the bravest thing as ever been done in Dorimare. Master Nathaniel, for how long he could not have said, went riding up and up the bridle path that wound in and out among the foothills, which gradually grew higher and higher. Not a living creature did he meet with, not a goat, not so much as a bird. He began to feel curiously drowsy, as if he were riding in a dream. Suddenly his consciousness seemed to have gone out of gear. To have missed one of the notches in time or space, for he found himself riding along a high road in the midst of a crowd of peasants in holiday attire. Looks like it should be high road. Like high street? I'll keep it as it is. Nor did this surprise him. His passive, uncritical mood was impervious to surprise. And yet, what were these people with whom he had mingled? An ordinary troop of holiday-making peasants? At first sight, so they seemed. And yet, what were these people with whom he had mingled? An ordinary troop of holiday-making peasants? At first sight, so they seemed. There were pretty girls with sunny hair escaping from under red and blue handkerchiefs, and rustic dandies cross-gartered with gay ribbons, and old women with quiet, nobly lined faces. A village community bound for some fair or merrymaking. But why were their eyes so fixed and strange? And why did they walk in absolute silence? And then the invisible cicerone of dreams, who is one's other self, whispered in his ear, "These are they whom men call dead." And, like everything else said by that cicerone, these words seemed to throw a flood of light on the situation, to make it immediately normal, even prosaic. Then the road took a sudden turn, and before them stretched a sort of heath dotted with the white booths of a fair. "That is the market of souls," whispered the whispered the invisible Cicerone. Of course, muttered Master Nathaniel, as if all his life he had known of its existence. And indeed he had forgotten all about Ranulph, and thought that to visit this fair had been the one object of his journey. They crossed the heath, and then they paid their gate money to a silent old man. And though Master Nathaniel paid with a coin of a metal and design he had never seen before, it was with no sense of a link missing in the chain of cause and effect that he produced it from his pocket. Outwardly there was nothing different in this fair from those in Dorimare. Pewterers, shoemakers, silversmiths were displaying their wares. There were cows and sheep and pigs, and refreshment booths and raree shows. Raree shows? I just want to make sure. Okay, it is correct. Second guessing myself again. But instead of the cheerful, variegated din that is part of the fun of the everyday fair, over this one there reigned complete silence, for the beasts were as silent as the people, dead silence and blazing sun. Master Nathaniel started off to investigate the booths. In one of them they were flinging darts at a pasteboard target on which were painted various of the heavenly bodies, with the moon in the centre. Anyone whose dart struck the moon was allowed to choose a prize from a heap of glittering miscellaneous objects. Golden feathers, shells painted with curious designs, brilliantly coloured pots, fans, silver sheep bells. They're like Hempy's new ornaments, thought Master Nathaniel. In another booth there was a merry-go-round of silver horses and gilded chariots, both sadly tarnished. It was a primitive affair that moved not by machinery, but by the ceaseless trudging of a live pony, a patient, dingy little beast, tied to it with a rope, and the motion generated a thin, cracked music, tunes that had been popular in Lud-in-the-Mist when tunes that had been popular in Lud-in-the-Mist when Master Nathaniel had been a little boy. There was, "Oh, you little charmer with your pretty puce bow." There was, "Old Daddy Popinjay fell down upon his rump." There was, Why did she cock her pretty blue eye at the lad with the silver buckles?" But except for one solitary little boy, the tarnished horses and chariots whirled round without riders, and the pert tunes sounded so thin and wan as to accentuate rather than destroy the silence and atmosphere of melancholy. In a hopeless, resigned sort of way, the little boy was sobbing. It was as if he felt that he was doomed by some inexorable fate to whirl round forever and ever, with the tarnished horses and chariots, the dingy, patient pony, and the old, cracked tunes. "It is not long," said the invisible Cicerone, "since that little boy was stolen from the mortals. He still can weep." Master Nathaniel felt a sudden tightening in his throat. Poor little boy. Poor little lonely boy. What was it reminded him of? Something painful and very near his heart. Round and round trudged the pony. Round and round went the hidden musical box, grinding out its thin, blurred tunes. Why did she cock her pretty blue eye at the lad with the silver buckles, when the penniless lad who was handsome and spry got naught but a rap on his knuckles? These vulgar songs, though faded, were not really old. Nevertheless, to Master Nathaniel, they were the oldest songs in existence, sung by the morning stars when all the world was young, for they were freighted with his childhood, and brought the memory, or rather the tang, the scent of the solemn, innocent world of children, a world sans archness, sans humour, sans vulgarity, or they had sounded as pure and silvery as a shepherd's pipe, where the little charmer with her puce bow and the scheming hussy who had cocked her blue eye had been own sisters to the pretty, fantastic ladies of the nursery rhymes, like them walking always to the accompaniment of tinkling bells and living on frangipani and syllabubs of peaches and cream, and whose gestures were stylized and actions preposterous, nonsense actions that needed no explanation, while mothers-in-law, shrewish wives, falling in love, they were just pretty words like brightly coloured beads strung together without meaning. Strung together without meaning. As Master Nathaniel listened, he knew that other people would have heard other tunes, whatever tunes through the milkman's whistle or the cracked fiddle of a street whatever tunes through the milkman's whistle or the cracked fiddle of a street musician, or the voices of young sparks returning from the tavern at midnight, the morning stars may have happened to sing in their own particular infancy. Oh, you little charmer with your pretty puce bow, I'll tell mamma if you carry on so. Round and round whirled the tarnished horses and chariots with their one pathetic little rider. Round and round trudged the pony, the little, dusty, prosaic pony. Master Nathaniel rubbed his eyes and looked round. He felt as if after a dive he was slowly rising to the surface of the water. The fair seemed to be coming alive. The silence had changed into a low murmur, and now it was swelling into the mingled din of chattering voices, lowing cows, grunting pigs, blasts from tin trumpets, hoarse voices of cheap jacks praising their wares. All the noises, in short, that one connects with an ordinary fair. He sauntered away from the merry-go-round and mingled with the crowd. All the stall-keepers were doing a brisk trade, but above all the market gardeners. Their stalls were All the stallkeepers were doing a brisk trade, but above all the market gardeners. Their stalls were simply thronged. Yeah, that sounds better. Oh, I love this bit. I just love the poetry of the language right here. And this, I feel like, is the reason that Hope Mirrlees is, so beloved by fantasy authors. Not just fantasy readers, but fantasy authors. If you look at Neil Gaiman's work, if you look at Susanna Clarke's work, they're heavily influenced by this book. Anyway, enough commentary. Their stalls were simply thronged. But lo and behold, the fruit that they were selling was of the kind he had seen in the mysterious room of the guild hall, and concealed inside the case of his grandfather's clock. It was fairy fruit. But the knowledge brought no sense of moral condemnation. Suddenly he realized that his throat was parched with thirst and that nothing would slake it but one of these translucent globes. The wizened old woman who was selling them cried out to him coaxingly. The wizened old woman who was selling them cried out to him coaxingly, "3 for a penny, sir. Or for you, I'll make it 4 for a penny, for the sake of your hazel eyes, lovey. You'll find them as grateful as dew to the flowers. 4 for a penny, pretty master, don't say no." But he had the curious feeling that one sometimes has in dreams, namely that he himself was inventing what was happening to him and could make it end as he chose. "Yes," he said to himself, "I am telling myself one of Hempy's old stories about a younger son who has been warned against eating anything offered to him by strangers. So, of course, I shall not touch it." So, with a curt, "No, thanky, nothing to I'm actually going to make a quick note to myself because this is really a good sample. And when I create the retail sample, I might use this for a sample. What chapter is this? 27. Okay. All right. All right. Nothing doing today. He contemptuously turned his back on the old woman and her fruit. But whose was that shrill voice? Probably that of some cheap jack whose patter or whose wares, to judge from the closely packed throng hiding him from view, had some particularly attractive quality. The voice sounded vaguely familiar, and, his curiosity aroused, Master Nathaniel joined the crowd of spectators. He could discern nothing but the top of a red head, but the patter was audible. Apologies, I know exactly who this person is. And if you've been following, you should too. It's obviously Willie. I just want to have a quick listen to him because he's not been in it for a little bit. "Now's your chance, gentlemen. Beauty doesn't keep, but rots like apples. Apples shies. 4 points if you hit her on the breast, 6 if you hit her on the mouth, and he who first gets 20 points wins the maid. Don't fight shy of the apple shies. Apples and beauty do not keep. There's a worm in both. Step up, gentlemen." Yes, he had heard that voice before. He began to shoulder his way through the crowd. It proved curiously yielding, and he had no difficulty in reaching the center of attraction, a wooden platform on which gesticulated, grimaced, and pirouetted who but his rascally groom, Willie Wisp, dressed as a harlequin. But Willie Wisp was not the strangest part of the spectacle. Out of the platform grew an apple tree, and tied to it was his own daughter, Prunella, while grouped around her in various attitudes of woe were the other crabapple blossoms. Suddenly, Master Nathaniel felt convinced that this was not merely a story he was inventing himself, but, as well, it was a dream, a grotesque, illogical synthesis of scraps of reality to which he could add what elements he chose. "What's happening?" he asked. "What's happening?" he asked his neighbour, but he knew the answer. Willie Wisp was selling the girls to the highest bidder to labour in the fields of gillyflowers. "But you have no right to do this," he cried out in a loud, angry voice. "No right whatever. This is not fairyland. It is only the elfin marches. They cannot be sold until they have crossed over into fairyland. I say they cannot be sold." All round him he heard awed whispers. "It is Chanticleer, Chanticleer the dreamer, who has never tasted fruit." Then he found himself giving a learned dissertation on the law of property, as observed in the elfin marches. The crowd listened to him in respectful silence. Even Willie Wisp was listening, and the crabapple blossoms gazed at him with inexpressible gratitude. With what seemed to him a superbly eloquent peroration. Hang on, I need to look this one up. It is peroration. Okay. Okay. Oops. With what seemed to him a superbly eloquent peroration, he brought his discourse to an end. Prunella stretched out her arms to him, crying, "Father, you have saved us! You and the law! You and the law! You and the law!" echoed the other crabapple blossoms. "Chanticleer and the law! Chanticleer and the law!" shouted the crowd. The fair had vanished. He was in a strange town, and was one of a great crowd of people all hurrying in the same direction. "They are looking for the bleeding corpse," whispered the invisible cicerone, and the words filled Master Nathaniel with an unspeakable horror. Then the crowd vanished, leaving him alone in a street as silent as the grave. He pressed forward, for he knew that he was looking for something, but what it was, he had forgotten. At every street corner he came on a dead man, guarded by a stone beggar with a face like the herm in the Gibbety's orchard. He was almost choked by the horror of it. The terror became articulate. Supposing one of the corpses should turn out to be that little lonely boy on the merry-go-round. This possibility filled him with an indescribable anguish. Suddenly he remembered about Ranulph. Ranulph had gone to the country from which there was no... Oh, all right, yeah. Had to stop to make a correction. But also, I've read this book before, but I never made this connection. This feels like Labyrinth. I didn't realize how much Lud-in-the-Mist influenced Labyrinth. I don't know if anybody's ever talked about that, but I really feel like that's the case. You've got the fairy fruit, which Sarah eats fairy fruit that Hoggle gives her. Sarah goes through a period where she completely forgets all about Toby, but she has this tugging on her heart. And then you have Duke Aubrey, which we're about to actually meet, which I think of like Jareth. And yes, that all just came to me just now. Hang on a sec. Ranulph, who had gone to the country. Ranulph had gone to the country from which there is no return. But he was going to follow him there and fetch him back. Nothing would stop him. He would push, if necessary, through fold after fold of dreams until he reached their heart. He bent down and touched one of the corpses. It was warm, and it moved. Oh, excuse me, my teleprompter's skipping up forward again. It was warm and it moved. As he touched it, he realized that he had incurred the danger of contamination from some mysterious disease. But it isn't real. It isn't real, he muttered. I'm inventing it all myself. And so, whatever happens, I shan't mind because it isn't real. It was growing dark. He knew that he was being followed by one of the stone beggars who had turned into a 4-footed animal called Petunis. In one sense, the animal was a protection. In another, a menace. And he knew that in summoning him, he must be very careful to use the correct ritual formulary. He had reached a square, on one side of which was a huge building with a domed roof. Light streamed from it through a great window of stained glass, on which was depicted a blue warrior fighting with a red dragon. No, it was not a stained glass window, but merely the reflection on the white walls of the building from a house in complete darkness on the opposite side of the square, inhabited by creatures made of red lacquer. He knew that they were expecting him to call, because they believed that he was courting one of them. What else could bring him here, save all this lovely spawn? Said a voice at his elbow. He looked round. Suddenly the streets were I gotta look that word up. Pullulating is a word I've never seen before. I guess I have seen it before because I have read this book before, but it did not jump out at me. Pullulating, which means very crowded and lively. Suddenly the streets were pullulating with strange, semi-human fauna. Tiny green men, the wax figures of his parents from Hempy's chimney-piece, grimacing grey beards with lovely children gambolling round them dressed in beetles' shards. Now they were dancing, some slow, old-fashioned dance, in and out, in and out. Why, they were only figures on a piece of tapestry flapping in the wind. Once more he felt his horse beneath him. But what were these little pattering footsteps behind him? He turned uneasily in his saddle to discover that it was nothing but a gust of wind, rustling a little eddy of dead leaves. The town and its strange fauna had vanished, and once more he was riding up the bridle path. But now it was night. Okay, so I am continuing on forward to the next chapter, which is going to be chapter 28. I know, I could have actually talked about the whole labyrinth connection while I was doing this, but I got so excited about it because I had not noticed it, quite honestly. And it can't just be coincidence. Especially because I know Brian Froud had a good deal to do with creating the story, and he had to have been familiar with it. Okay, moving on. Chapter 28. By Chapter 28. By the sun, moon, and stars, and the golden apples of the west. Though it was a relief to have returned to the fresh air of reality, Master Nathaniel was frightened. He realized that he was alone at dead of night in the elfin marches, and the moon kept playing tricks on him, turning trees and boulders into goblins and wild beasts, cracking her jokes, true humorous that she was, with a solemn, impassive face. But how was this? She was a waxing moon and almost full, while the night before, or what he supposed was the night before, she'd been a half-moon on the wane. Had he left time behind him in Dorimare? Then suddenly, like some winged monster rushing from its lair, there sprang up a mighty wind. The pines creaked and rustled and bent beneath its onslaught. The grasses whistled. The clouds flocked together and covered the face of the moon. Several times he was nearly lifted from his saddle. He drew his cloak closely round him and longed with an unspeakable longing for his warm bed in Lud. And it flashed into his mind that what he had so often imagined in that bed to enhance his sense of well-being was now actually occurring. He was tired, he was cold, and the wind was finding the fissures in his doublet. Suddenly, as if some hero had slain the monster, the wind died down. The moon sailed clear of the clouds, and the pines straightened themselves and once more stood at attention, silent and motionless. In spite of this, his horse grew strangely restive, rearing and jibbing, as if something was standing before it in the path that frightened it. And in vain Master Nathaniel tried to quiet and soothe it. Then it shuddered all over and fell heavily to the ground. Fortunately, Master Nathaniel was thrown clear, and was not hurt beyond the inevitable bruises entailed by the fall of a man of his weight. He struggled to his feet and hurried to his horse. It was stone dead. For some time he sat beside it, his last link with Lud and familiar things, as yet too depressed. As yet, too depressed in mind and aching in body to continue his journey on foot. But what were those sudden strains of piercingly sweet music, and from what strange instrument did they proceed? They were too impersonal for a fiddle, too passionate for a flute, and much too sweet for any pipes or timbrels. It must be a human, or superhuman voice, for now he was beginning to distinguish the words. There are windfalls of dreams, there's a wolf in the stars, and life is a nymph who will never be thine, with lily, germander, and sops in wine, with sweet briar and bonfire and strawberry wire and columbine. The voice stopped, and Master Nathaniel buried his face in his hands and sobbed as if his heart would break. In this magically sweet music once more he had heard the note. It held this time. No menace as to things to come, but it aroused in his breast an agonizing tumult of remorse for having allowed something to escape that he would never, never recapture. It was as if he had left his beloved with harsh words and had returned to find her dead. Through his agony, he was conscious of a hand laid on his shoulder. "Why, Chanticleer, old John o' Dreams, what ails you? Has the cock's crow become too bitter-sweet for Chanticleer?" said a voice, half tender and half mocking in his ear. He turned round, and by the light of the moon saw standing behind him Duke Aubrey. The Duke smiled. "Well, Chanticleer," he said, "so we meet at last. Your family has been dodging me down the centuries, but some day you were bound to fall into my snares. And though you did not know it, You have been working for some time past as one of my secret agents. How I laughed when you and Ambrose Honeysuckle pledged each other in words taken from my mysteries. And little did you think when you stood cursing and swearing at the door of my tapestry room that you had pronounced the most potent charm in fairy. And he threw back his head and broke into peal upon peal of silvery laughter. Suddenly his laughter stopped, and his eyes, as he looked at Master Nathaniel, became wonderfully compassionate. Poor Chanticleer, poor John o' Dreams, he said gently. I have often wished my honey were not so bitter to the taste. Believe me, Chanticleer, I fain would find an antidote to the bitter herb of life, but none grows this side of the hills, or the other. And yet, I have never tasted fairy fruit, said Master Nathaniel in a low, broken voice. There are many trees in my orchard, and many and various are the fruit they bear, music and dreams and grief and sometimes joy. All your life, Chanticleer, you have eaten fairy fruit, and some day, it may be, you will hear the note again, but that I cannot promise. And now I will grant you a vision. They are sometimes sweet to the taste. He paused, and then he said, Do you know why it was that your horse fell down dead? It was because you had reached the brink of fairyland. The winds of fairy slew him. Come with me, Chanticleer. He took Master Nathaniel's hand and dragged him to his feet, and they scrambled a few yards further up the bridle path and stepped onto a broad plateau. Beneath them lay what, in the uncertain moonlight, looked like a stretch of desolate uplands. Then Duke Aubrey raised his arms high above his head and cried out in a loud voice, By the sun, moon, and stars, and the golden apples of the west. At these words the uplands became bathed in a gentle light and proved to be fair and fertile, the perpetual seat of spring, for there were vivid greens green patches of young corn, and pillars of pink and white smoke, which were fruit trees in blossom, and pillars of blue blossom, which was the smoke of distant hamlets, and a vast meadow of cornflowers and daisies, which was the great inland sea of fairy, and everything, ships, spires, houses, was small and bright and delicate, yet real. It was not unlike Dorimare, or rather the transfigured Dorimare he had once seen from the fields of Gramarye. And as he gazed, he knew that in that land no winds ever howled at night, and that everything within its borders had the serenity and stability of trees, the unchanging peace of pictures. Then, suddenly, it all vanished. Duke Aubrey had vanished too, and he was standing alone on the edge of a black abyss, while wafted on the wind came the echo of light, mocking laughter. Was fairyland then a delusion? Had Ranulph vanished into nothingness? For a second or two he hesitated, and then he leaped down into the abyss. All right, and that is the end of chapter 28 of Lud-in-the-Mist. Thank you so much for joining me. If you happen to find this video and decide, hey, I want to look at this watch live, which seems pretty unlikely since I don't think that YouTube are pushing it. But if you do, I will be on here, I promise, around 10:30 tomorrow to continue Lud-in-the-Mist. Bye for now.